This is Andrea with Parking Lot Debrief. All right. I'm here with one of my besties, Cameo Hunsaker, and she's here to talk about the research she did about the interpreter shortage, which will give voice, give label, give understanding of the why we're all feeling and seeing what we're seeing out there. I know Cameo from Western Oregon University when I continued my master's program there, and we were virtual buddies and have only actually hugged each other like two times in real life. So it's possible to have friendships where you never see this person's torso and down. You can just see them online or share Marco Polos forever and ever. So, Cameo, tell us about who you are and how you got to where you're at.
Hi, yeah, happy to. So I graduated from the University of Arizona with a degree in deaf studies with a concentration in educational interpreting. And then I interpreted for quite some time. Started teaching at the Phoenix College Interpreter Preparation Program. Decided that I didn't know what I was doing. Like I was shocked to find how little, I don't want to say support for new teachers because my program was very supportive, but there's no like tangible curriculum to
Right.
use, and you're kind of flying by the seat of your pants. And how do you teach this and all of that? So I went to grad school at Western Oregon, which is where Andrea mentioned that we met. Um, and then after grad school, I ended up with a job with my state's commission, so the Arizona Commission for the Deaf and the Hard of Hearing. I am the interpreter professional development specialist. So that essentially means that I am developing programs and policies and services for the greater good of ASL interpreters in the state of Arizona. And I'm their staff interpreter, which is how I landed in ending up doing this research.
Right. And why, essentially, the title is like interpreter shortage.
Mhm.
And it's a silly question for me to ask. Why is this important? Why does this need to be talked about? It's glaringly obvious, but please do tell.
I mean, well, so what I found was, yeah, it's glaringly obvious right now, but it's not different than it has been. And yet there's this like feel out there that it is different. And there are elements that are different about it. So to back up, we have had a shortage since the field began. Um,
I
when
can, I imagine we all feel that just always was just not enough to fill the jobs. But post COVID, I imagine we're feeling it more.
Well, we're either, so who's to
Yes.
say? We're either
Right.
feeling it more or it's more apparent. Or
Mm,
like we're more connected now than we ever have before. And
right.
the uh advancements in technology in the field of interpreting certainly has had an impact where they didn't before. But like we have to be careful about like correlation is not causation, right? So I was surprised when I did this research that a lot of interpreters did not know much about the shortages that were before, and it's well documented. I mean, there's research and journal articles and news reports from decades and decades ago about the shortage. But how this all originally started was, as we all know, when RID was like first being founded in the 1960s, um, that was the first step to turning this kind of hodgepodge volunteer
Homegrown.
occupation, not even an
Hmm.
occupation, like service, right? A homegrown service into a professional field. And there's what I also learned is there's a like kind of prescribed order of how a field becomes a profession. Um,
And I think
and
we'll
we
get
met,
into that today of
yeah,
where we are in that and if we have even fully professionalize ourselves or not according to this model, which I'm excited to hear about.
Right. Well, like we messed up from the beginning.
Ah, well,
We whoops. We screwed
right,
up from the beginning. And we didn't screw up, like society, really the
right.
government. And I work
I
for the
mean,
government, so I'm not trying to like bite a hand, right? But the when RID was first formed, it was going along what's considered like the most effective process for professionalization. But then we had all of these federal laws that passed that all of the sudden increased
yeah,
the number of trained trained interpreters in all of these different fields, education, courts, government, all of these things. And of course, professionalized aspect of our field hadn't
caught
developed
up
yet. We were
at
still
all.
like infants.
Right.
And on top of that, there wasn't enough people in the workforce to fit the bill. So what you ended up seeing was lots of people who were not qualified, who surely didn't even know that RID was a thing, right? Think about back in the 70s. They were just like, "Oh, I learned some how to fingerspell in brownies in elementary school. Can I be of any assistance?" And all of these entities are like, "Thank God. Yeah,
Right.
come on in." So we had this split from the very beginning of this professionalized process where education and credentialing and skill set and those kinds of things were the leading characteristics. And then you have this population of not only providers, like interpreters, but also institutions who are like, we always just grab someone who flapped their hands and that was good enough, right? I'm kind of looking at you, K-12 schools, right? That was one of the areas that was the hardest hit by this split. And ever
Professional.
since we've had this struggle between these two like the Y and the road. You know what I mean?
And you
And
say like,
lots
go ahead.
I was just going to say lots of interpreters don't realize that our field started out that way and we've never like reconciled with that. We've never figured out how to recover.
And that's, I'm hoping we get there. I hope this is
Mhm.
a start because this study, what you're doing, has been done in different ways by others. But um, as you say, now we may feel the shortage more. I even saw many comments on Facebook throughout the handful of last years of people saying this shortage, you're saying it, but it's not real. A lot of people were like, this isn't actually real. Y'all are just making this as if it's not. We've always been. But right, the shortages felt more. And I wrote down, it made me think of in the last how many years, access is cool, access is popular, which is wonderful. Wonderful. Absolutely. But we are put in more spaces and we still have the same amount or less amount of interpreters. So,
I
like you're
mean, how many
saying,
jobs do we get that are
feel,
like air guitar
yeah,
jobs, right? Yeah, totally.
which are needed and great. It's just we don't have the manpower or the person power to do it. But this has been done in other states, or who else has looked into the shortage? And I know you have stuff from stuff that was done 20 years ago, even to lead into this.
Yeah, yeah. I did a pretty deep dive. My inner nerd came out and so I looked at the historical data and like you mentioned, other states have already done this. Like Minnesota is in the middle of their interpreting forward. Is that what it's called? Washington State, Hawaii, Louisiana, like many states have been funded through their legislature to
To look at their
pay.
state,
Uh-huh.
to look at their own state. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
did Arizona do that? Did yours do only Arizona? Obviously.
Yes.
But is it
Yeah.
generally applicable? We can say this, all of your individual state stuff can be widely applicable to the US,
Not
I'd
all, but
imagine.
most, I would
Okay.
say. There are definitely common threads, but because the fields are so different in each state, and the needs are different in different states, I found that yeah, without that kind of consistency, each state kind of does need to do their own because they're dealing with different challenges. Like
Hence the problem.
it, totally
And that
one
part
of
of the
the
problem.
totally one of the core issues of the problem. So like for us here in Arizona, um, spoken language agencies and their business practices played a pretty big role in the results that we came up with. That might be less of an issue in a place like Nebraska, where Nebraska licenses VRI companies. So their state government has more authority and more control
Mhm.
over the quality of services. I assume like that's the point of licensure. Whether how that's applied or enacted, I don't know anything about that. So all you Nebraska interpreters don't come at me. Um, but uh,
But we're
but
working
so
more nationwide. We're working more virtually. So like a
right.
lot of this is really kind of crisscrossy.
hmm There's lots of common threads for sure. For sure.
Um, how did you even start? This is a huge thing to look into. We, I feel our field has research here and there, but not enough to go off of something else. So where did you even start? What frameworks, what other stuff did you even look into?
So this whole thing was born out of the Board of Commissioners from the Arizona Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. One of the commissioners at one of the board meetings brought up the fact that they were getting more and more complaints from the
Mm,
deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind communities that there was this shortage. And so the board tasked the agency with figuring out what the what. Like, is this really a problem? What does the problem look like? What are possible solutions? Things like that. And I was pretty new with the agency. And so you can imagine my shock when they were like, Cameo will do it. I was like,
do a
oh,
70-page, 120-page research. You'll be all
well,
right.
okay, so that's not on them. That one's on me. That one's
You,
on me. So, like, without a doubt, I always overcomplicate things
you?
on my.
Yes.
Stop it. Stop it. Right. So, like,
But
there's
to our
there's
benefit at this point, to our benefit, because then we get all this information.
the
So,
nerd overachiever hyper focus in me was like, I'm gonna write a thesis again. Um, and like I didn't start out like that, but I knew that to start, I needed to figure out what had already been done.
right.
So I started in essentially like a lit review. I started reading over the research that was out there, and you know
What
how
was
it
it?
rabbit holes. This thing, this paper cited this thing, and so I read that thing, and that cited this thing, and here we go down the spiral, right? So
Hmm.
now I had this whole like chunk of data, and I'm like, oh, okay, these are like this is what I have to work off of because really part of the goal was to figure out is the shortage today worse than it was before and like how to even do that. So what a few of the documents that I leaned on really heavily were the other states that went before me and most
Mm.
of them hired like like firms, like consultation firms to do all of this, community surveys and research and all of this stuff and came up with these beautiful reports. And so I really got to stand on their shoulders and take their lead with
Hmm.
how to approach this. Um, what I found was a lot of them referenced a thing I had never heard of before as an interpreter. It's called Tseng's model of professionalization. I might be pronouncing Tseng wrong. It's spelled Tseng. So Tseng's model of professionalization. Um, Almost all of the previous reports used this. So of course I went down
Interesting.
that rabbit hole and learned as much as I could about that. And so essentially what this model of professionalization does, it's like this framework where the researcher outlines like the phases an occupation goes through that develop certain attributes and characteristics to achieve professionalization. And there seem to be like common, like a common path, right? So like a fully professionalized field that we would think of would be something like the medical field, like doctors, attorneys, architects, kind of like the things that we feel are like, oh, like, do you know, like
That have systems in place, that have policies, that have all the things.
all the things that go along with it, and like a clear path on how to get there and what you need, and you know,
Would we
thing.
say those are fields that have been around for a very long time?
Sure. That
I mean,
this process definitely takes a long time, and it's a complicated process. It's not something that you're just like bang 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 and now all of a sudden I'm a profession. Like that's not how it works. And
yeah.
a great examples of that are the fields that Tseng would consider an emerging profession. So these are professions that like have some struggles, like teachers, social workers, that kind of category where like people are doing it and some things are smooth. Like I know how to become a teacher in Arizona, right? But
Right.
there's consternation about pay or support or
Right, right.
expectations or
That is
like
solid.
all of the BS that comes along that limits uh, that teachers feel limits them from being effective teachers, right? So that's kind of why that group would be considered an emerging profession. And then there are marginalized professions. These are professions like being a foster parent or a childcare provider, an in-home caregiver, things like that, the kinds of things where we're like, it's for sure work. They for sure don't get the kind of pay or support or policy that supports the work that they do, like real marginalized occupations. So
And
it
we are
essentially,
not that. We're not even there. Are we in marginalized, emerging, or fully?
so so Anna Witter-Merrithew and Leilani Johnson did a whole study in
Mm,
2004 that took Tseng's model of professionalization and applied it to the interpreting field. Now, this is 2004, so 21 years ago.
21 years ago.
I
I
know,
think that's why I'm most frustrated with all of this is I'm sure they brought up same information and you have the same information essentially, and we're just older. And shit hasn't changed, and I think that's the most frustrating piece.
not only has it not changed, I would maybe argue that things are maybe a little worse.
Interesting.
Based
In
on
terms
what
of this model, right?
right, based on what I saw from Witter-Merrithew and Johnson's
Mm-hmm.
research. Like I wonder, I would give a kidney for the two of them to come back together and
Yes.
redo the same study with today's situation because so much has changed in the interpreting field. I would love to see what what they think the comparison is between 2004
Yeah.
and 2025. Very cool. Very cool. So anyway, what Witter-Merrithew and Leilani Johnson, they put ASL interpreting between marginalized and emerging.
Ah, okay.
So not totally that we do have some structure, we do meet some characteristics in like the light form, but they would at that time in 2004, they wouldn't have even really considered us as emerging yet. We were still behind.
I don't
Not
feel
behind, not behind. We're still emerging. We're still
right.
in the process of that growth on that timeline.
And I know nothing, but I just would imagine that's we're kind of in the same spot. I don't feel like we fully fit in the emerging. We are not on par with social workers and teachers in terms of all of the things they have around them. Interesting.
Well,
Interesting.
the cool thing about Tseng's model and about how Witter-Merrithew and Johnson like applied it to our field is that it gets into the nitty-gritty of like characteristics. Like there's I don't know, 8, 9, 10 different characteristics. And each one, if you rate your field on each one and then kind of like average them, that gives you a feel of where you are on that continuum. So it so Tseng's model gives a little bit more nuance to what it takes to be considered a professionalized field as opposed to not. So it's not like how do I
Right. We have
compare
a
myself? Like I can from a layperson's perspective, I can probably like anecdotally talk about why the interpreting field is not quite so as established as like the law field. I can talk about that, but like, how do I label those things? How do I measure those things? Tseng's model goes into all of that.
that's I like that because we had kind of said this before that then it gives label, gives word, gives steps to actually stand on. And it's not just me bitching. It's not just me being like, well, this is, and hopefully, and I'm going to ask you at the end, hopefully then there's solution. Then there's actual, because I know we can find why we aren't fulfilling each of these characteristics or where we are or where we're not. But what I'm curious about is what can we do to then do them? And who's
Yeah,
going
I
to
mean,
do them?
that's the big question, right? That's the big
So
question.
you can just dive into the characteristics. I'd love to hear each one and then how they each apply
Yeah, yeah, for
to
sure.
us.
So, yeah, so kind of like to piggyback on what you were saying, when I was researching about these characteristics, it the reason why they were so impactful to me was because as interpreters, we have a lot to say. We have a lot to say about the ills of our field and the challenges
Mhm.
and the struggles that we have. But most of the time that is viewed by like society as us just being divas or
Yes.
with un, unrealistic expectations. And when I learned about these characteristics, I was like, oh, what what we're actually frustrated with that we didn't maybe have the language for previous is it's we're frustrated with the fact that we're lagging behind in these categories. And these categories aren't us being divas. It's not us um, being needy or too much or any of those other things that women are commonly attributed with, right? It's us being frustrated that we are not moving forward on that continuum for these characteristics. So that's why I love these so much.
I just want a caveat of we have that, hence the name of this podcast, Parking Lot Debrief. These are the conversations we're having standing in a parking lot with our team after a job, or with a deaf person during the break, or with your CDI, or whatever. I always want to give the caveat that just because these conversations are happening, or because these conversations are happening, the point in the end is to better ourselves, which in the end will better our interpretation, which will the end better the process for all parties involved, deaf community, hearing community, everyone. So, right, we're screaming into the void all of these frustrations. And I know there's also a pushback of, well, if you become too professionalized, then you're disconnected from the community and you're too professional and you're up here and they're down there or something like that. Um, I feel that it will bring me closer to the community only because I won't be like shadow boxing over here something that I can't even fix when I can, if that's taken care of, I can then sit comfortably and do my job even better, if that makes sense. So,
It totally does. And
mm,
actually, there's a word for that, right? So like
tell
what
me.
what Andrea just expressed is totally something that we've all talked about, but like we have to we have to tell in a story
Yeah,
like you just did, right? But what that's actually called is market disorders.
it
So
feels
market
disordered.
it legit. So market disorders are conflicts within a profession that leads the profession away or is a barrier to that continuum of professionalization. And I think a huge one for us that's very unique for us is that the deaf community used to be the gatekeepers of our field. They raised us, they approved us,
Hmm.
they they had that power. And one of the things that is inherently lost in professionalization is that that gatekeeping power then moves to institutions, right? Interpreter education programs, certifying bodies, licensing bodies. And we all know that most of those institutions are run by people who don't know
Right.
about the deaf community or interpreting. So it essentially is taking something that used to be very relational and transitioning it into something that's transactional.
Yes.
In fact, so as part of the study, I sent out surveys to a bunch of different stakeholders, people and entities that are involved in the interpreting process, right? We talk to IEP, interpreter education programs. We talk to interpreters themselves. We talk to hiring entities. We talked to agencies that specialize in ASL.
Deaf
We
people?
we did not include deaf people. We did not because, and here's why. I would have loved to. First of
Yeah.
all, there's already a lot of research that's already
Mm.
out there about deaf people's experience with requesting interpreters. But also, and this is a sad point, when we're looking at the pipeline of interpreting, deaf people are not part of that pipeline. Besides them requesting the service, after that, they relinquish not only all power, but any involvement in the process.
Is
And
that something, if it were to change, would improve things? I mean, for their experience, absolutely. Ooh,
it's a great question. I wish I knew the answer.
same.
I
Dang.
I want to say yes. I want to say yes because like I can see different categories in Tseng's model where deaf people being more involved in the process could be a solution. The problem is that it's really hard to predict those like unforeseen consequences that happen down the line. Let me be very clear. I am in no way advocating for deaf people continuing to be
Right.
um, sidelined from this process. I think that ultimately that is something that we are lacking, especially when we're talking about the transition between relational work to transactional work, right? Deaf people absolutely have to be part of this process. Is that a solution to
Right.
what we consider the shortage, or what will the unintended consequences be? That's a big question mark. I don't know the answer.
I'll make note of something that I know is coming up, but um, do you have a word here that I want you to at least talk about?
Oh, so in that's where I was going. Thank you. So in all of these surveys that we sent out, um, when when interpreters were asked about why they think there's a shortage, um, one of the one of the respondents called that transition from relational connection to transactional dynamics. They called that the McDonaldization of our profession. And I
Yeah.
thought that that like summed it up chef's kiss so perfectly.
Yeah.
Um, that it, yeah, yeah.
With all that said, I'm hoping there's a way to make this a professionalized field while holding on to the relational aspect.
Finding that balance
Because,
is part of the challenge for sure.
and yeah. So, what are the characteristics to a
So,
professional field, and where do we
yeah.
fall with that?
Yeah. So, okay, here we go. So, the first of Tseng's characteristics is called systemic theory. So, the way that Tseng defined this is it's like the formal procedures that knowledge and skills are passed down to future generations of practitioners. So, that's kind of low-hanging fruit. Interpreter education programs is what we're looking at with this. Now, as we
Yes.
mentioned, in the past, that it was the deaf community. Now it's IPPs and ITPs, right? So right there is that market disorder, right there is the conflict. And there's more conflict that's embedded in that there's no standardization
As I say, it's
for
the Wild West. There's
it is the Wild West. And we as interpreter
instructors.
program instructors, presently or in the past, have witnessed this firsthand. But you're like, what do you do?
Can I ask? I've never been to CIT. Can I ask, is there a push in CIT? What is it again? Please tell me.
The Conference
CIT.
of Interpreter Trainers.
Thank you. Of, hey, let's standardize this. Hey, what conversations are you having? Can we all get it together in one spot? I mean, I'm just asking because I don't know.
I don't know either.
Oh, okay.
I
Okay.
also have not been to CIT,
Okay.
although I hope to go to the
Okay.
next one. I'm not sure.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
I would be curious.
Yeah.
Yes. Lack of
So
standardization.
lack of standardization. And like there's a lot of complaints out there about the efficacy of interpreter education programs. And even to that, I'm like, okay, but what are the expectations, right? We have a societal expectation that when someone goes to college and they graduate, that means they're workforce ready. And we all know that that is not the case for
Does
interpreters. But there are other fields that are the same, like
right,
nursing, med school, right? Being a doctor. No
right.
one graduates from nursing school and is put in a hospital and doing the nursing thing. There's a paid on the
Thing.
job training where their expectations and responsibilities slowly increase as they gain that hands-on skill, right? So interpreting isn't alone in that. Interpreting is uh, different because we don't have that scaffolded
Handoff.
approach
Right.
to, right, exactly.
Because so this can speak to lack of standardization in terms of curriculum, what folks are leaving with in terms of skill, 2 year programs versus 4 year programs, timing, and that gap, the gap after graduation. That all encompasses, which
Hmm.
there's a lot of research or thesi about this, the gap discussion. Um,
Yeah, there are some other of Tseng's
man,
characteristics that touch on this as well. There's
also,
definitely
okay,
overlap
okay.
throughout the characteristics. But yeah, interpreter education programs is kind of where um, systemic theory is where interpreter education programs would really sit. So when
Problem
we
number one, folks, go figure
yeah,
that out. Okay,
when
number
when
two.
right.
Jeez.
So the next characteristic is saying called authority. And that's essentially how much influence practitioners have over policy making that impacts their work. So if you, your face.
Zero.
So
Zero.
so if you imagine a field with high authority, the practitioners are valued for their expertise. And they tend to have strong connections with like policymakers. They're brought in to shape public policy for their field, right? We can all imagine um, fields that are like this. I would say that even fields that we imagine to have strong authority absolutely would come back and be like,
We
we're
don't, right.
we're we're never consulted, and the government makes policies, and they're not in line with our standards of practice at all. Like I think of insurance
Right.
companies and medical providers, right? Certainly, um, they would, if you asked a physician, they would probably feel that they have low authority because of how insurance companies dictate how they practice medicine, right? But when you look at policy, right, the fact that medical professionals are brought to the table, that people generally understand what they do, right?
I'm
That
like,
that actually
I
gives them
don't,
high authority.
where
Ooh,
there's,
you froze for a second.
okay, we're back, I think. Um, there's policies to get us in the room to do our job for the person who needs access. There's zero policies that take care of me. the interpreter.
Hmm.
Is there? I mean, like,
Hmm.
there's no, because I've talked about that. My husband works in all of this area, and he's like, well, only way you're going to make change. Do you have lobbyists? Do you have people going? Do you have people who are going to go fight to go make policies and regulatory things that have teeth to govern those agencies? And I'm like, I no, RID, I don't know. Like, I think that's what they're supposed to be doing, or some areas are supposed to be doing that, but like, I don't want to do it. That's the hard part. So,
I
yes.
mean, I don't even know that we would be qualified to do that. Like,
Right.
I'm not a
No,
qualified
no,
lobbyist,
no.
right? And so then you look at positions like mine, which I'm so grateful for,
Yeah.
right? ACDHH is we do lobby with our local government, and it's wonderful that
Local,
ACDHH,
yes. I would say
sure,
local, many states have those commissions. Absolutely. Yes,
right,
I'll say that.
right. But remember, so if I'm considered the expert at my commission and I'm feeding this information to whomever is lobbying, and they're feeding this information to like the political process is like a ball of yarn,
Of
right?
course.
And how throughout how many of that the like telephone game is that message being
Right.
watered down or changed in some way. Um, I I can't think off the top of my head anywhere where an actual practitioner has a seat at the table of decision making, right? And this goes all the way to the national level. So I think that
That's what I was thinking.
one of the main problems I think that we have with authority is the fact that there is no federal legal mandate that empowers a deaf consumer or the interpreting community for what they know to be the most effective way to
Right.
provide services, specifically the deaf community, right?
Right.
So, um, ADA, we all know, has several titles, and most of our work, I would say, for most of us, is under ADA Title III. Title III covers everything that's not like governments, essentially.
Right.
Any business person, organization that is offering a good or service, right? So that's it's the big blanket title. And in that title, the decision making for what kind of accommodation in Title III, they call it a oh my gosh, why is the word escaping me? A public accommodation and an auxiliary aid and service. There it is. So in Title III, accommodations, what we generally call accommodations, are called auxiliary aids and services. In Title III, the person who chooses what auxiliary aid and service to use is the hearing person, is the hiring entity
Of course.
who is the one person in this entire system that knows nothing about the deaf community or sign language or interpreting
Which
or
is
like
what
anything.
we complain about all the time. Like these are the nuggets that we are already, we and the deaf community, all of us are already like up in
Right.
arms
And
with.
if you were frustrated before, wait till you hear this. Okay, I am not an attorney. I am not here to give legal advice whatsoever. But an ADA attorney once told me that the deaf community is the only disability community, so the only protected class under the ADA where oppression is built into the law. So if you look at a person who is in a wheelchair, that person does not need to go to a business, request that a ramp be built, be told that there is a different approach for them to get in, try to get in the building, fail, and then the business
Building. Yeah.
has to build them the ramp,
Hmm.
right? We have predetermined standards for
Mm.
how large doorways need to be and how low sinks need to be and how many ramps or other physical accessibility features. When a building is built, whether they're ever going to invite a person in a wheelchair into their building or not, they have to meet those standards. But with the deaf community, The hearing person gets to pick the accommodation, then the deaf person has to use it, and then the burden of proof that
Right.
it was ineffective is on the deaf person.
And they're never believed or even understood
Right. How
of,
many times do we see those situations where the hearing person's like, "Oh, that was fine.
of course
I
it was fine
understood
for
it.
you.
I understood everything." Right? That is an example of the lack of authority that the deaf community has in their lives, which we feel as interpreters,
Yeah.
right? Because that is mirrored back on us when we are the interpreter saying this situation needs a CDI or this needs a team, and
Or
we are
not
having to,
VRI.
or not VRI, right? Or we're having to fight for those kinds of things. That is examples
Yes.
of lack of authority. Now, a lot of states have licensure, right?
Yes.
So licensure, it, I can't speak for all states, but from what I know, and certainly what I know about Arizona licensure, the goal was to increase the level of authority, right? So making some kind of bare minimum standard of what is considered appropriate for an ASL interpreter. But the
Right.
fact that interpreters have to constantly educate people about why this is complex work and why there are certain groups of people who do or don't have the complex skill sets needed to achieve effective communication, right? That is all examples of our lack of authority. And there are many states out there that don't
Oh,
have any requirements at all. I think we're
at
at
all.
22 states that have licensure now, and they all look different, right? And every state licensure looks different. But the point is that without that like authority, interpreters have limited to no power over working conditions, over standards of our work, especially in K-12 and VRS and VRI, and even with like agency business practices. Like those are all
Because
examples of that market disorder of authority.
because you bring up that last part of where we lack, and again, huge nod to that the deaf community has even less agency and authority in this, and that's where the focus should be. But speaking about where we sit as interpreters, um, you speak at a federal level or all of the policies that we could have, and then you can zero in even on my work every single day and my even lack of authority to deal with agencies and to say, hey, no, actually, I do need a team. No, you don't. Yes, I do. No, I don't. Like that argument, that lack of even trusting me as a professional in this setting, it's getting better, I will say. Agencies are listening more. I think mostly because many interpreters are finally given the finger and saying, I'm not doing that anymore in many of those situations because it's damaging me, it's damaging the process, it's not working for the client. But then you say, especially K-12, VRS, VRI, those systems are hardly or like firmly set to where me being mad about it is not going to change. Me not fitting your minutes and doing the things is just going to be dismissing me because someone else is going to fill that spot.
Right.
So that's where
Which
my
is
frustration mostly lies.
which is the whole reason why we're seeing this push to unionize in
Yes.
VRS
Yeah.
settings. I mean, the push for unionization is essentially interpreters' um, grassroots effort at
What
trying to
else?
address all of all of
Right.
these categories, maybe especially authority.
Right.
Um, yeah.
And in the end, really, what I would want is we get some authority so then we can say, here's our few little things, and then defer to the deaf people. Because, like, that would, we could give way and give space to that if we even could just like nudge in any of these spaces a little bit. We could go on and
Or
on.
or is the process, should it be
Right.
flipped, right?
Right. Right.
Should we be collectively working towards more authority for the deaf community who will then
Right. we
bring us
right.
to the table as practitioners and experts in the practice of. Um,
And the only last note
yeah.
I have with authority is for years I thought I had no choice of my pay rate. I had no choice. I had no team. I just have to. Sometimes I wonder if our feeling of lack of authority is because we've told ourselves we don't have it.
Or
And
we
I
don't
feel like,
know, right?
right.
I would say that we've both been an interpreter for 20-ish years. And
Hmm.
if you talk to interpreters who were the generation before us, um, about like the big push for you're an independent contractor, act like one, right? Name your rates,
Run your business.
run your business, like all of that. That is kind of relatively new for our
Yes.
field, right?
Yes.
Decades ago, interpreters were lucky if they even got paid anything. Like
Right.
they were like, oh, crumbs, scraps, thank you.
Right.
Because we were at an even worse off, lower end of that spectrum
Right.
on professionalization. So all of that is new to
I just
us
I
as a
put that
field.
out there to just make sure we also look at ourselves and not lay in this victim space of like, well, I just can't. And I don't know if I should, but like Austin in certain communities do take stands and do say, no, we won't, and band together as interpreters and say, we will not accept X, Y, and Z. And things can change in small spaces. Um, and I just wish, and that's essentially kind of the point of your research and the point of this podcast and the point of all these conversations is to hopefully we can like link arms at some point. And it's not to like mow down everything with anger. It's more of just like, hello, more of a can we get a real conversation? I don't even know who I'm yelling at. I don't even know who I need to talk to. That's the hard part is
Yeah,
we're
100%.
saying
I
this
would,
to each other.
right, right. I
uh,
would say like, so since I did this research,
mhm.
you know how whenever you make an ethical decision, right? We, as interpreters, are trained to reference the Code of Professional Conduct, right? And look at it in from all of the different viewpoints, right? Like, how is this going to affect this deaf consumer? How is this going to affect
Right.
deaf consumers in general? How is this going to affect me? How is this going to affect interpreters in general? The system, the groups, the community, we're supposed to look at it in all of these different levels. I've started looking at those kinds of situations from the viewpoint of these these market disorders, these characteristics, right? Because I didn't have the language for it before.
Right.
So now if I'm in a conversation with an agency about about a rate, let's say, um, and they are telling me it has to be this rate. Now I feel even more validated
Yes.
because not only that it feels selfish, right? It feels selfish to be like,
Yes.
no, I want my base pay is more than what you're offering. And we get lots of feels about, oh, if I do this, does
Yes.
that mean that this deaf consumer is going to go without access? And like all of the conflicts that we have within ourselves. What I now can add to this mix is how is this applied to these market disorders?
And
Is
are we helping us move up or are we pulling us back down by
right,
acting or not acting?
right,
Ooh.
right. So sometimes it makes the decision harder, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it makes the decision easier because now I have a framework to look at, like, oh, when I'm talking about the interpreting field, maybe I'm not even talking about like my local community. I'm talking about like the professionalization of our
Yes.
field, which impacts future generations. I mean,
Yes.
like it widens the view quite a bit, quite a
And we'll
bit.
get to compensation. I see that on the list.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. That's one of
we
them.
can go on, we could do a whole episode on authority and agency and having a
Totally.
say. Whew. The next one I see is credentials.
So another one of Tseng's characteristics for a field to become professionalized is standardized credentials, right? The field has to have a recognized standard on what is entry level skill, knowledge, what have you, right?
Is that
So
generally known of what's entry level? I mean, I think we know it just by seeing it,
it's,
but it's not.
do you mean for interpreters?
Yes.
No, it's all over the board.
Yeah, but I mean, like we can I can see an interpreter and be like, that's beginner, that's middle ground, but like not standardized and watched and regulated to where they
It's
go and what they do.
it's not standardized
Okay.
and it's not standardized at the system level. I'll give you a perfect example.
Okay.
So during the moratorium, Arizona, like many states,
Moratorium of the
are,
NIC.
sorry, the RID's moratorium of all testing.
Okay.
Many states, like Arizona, decided to start accepting the BEI.
Yes.
For anybody listening or watching who isn't aware, the BEI has different levels of testing, right? You start by taking the BEI basic, and if you take this test in Texas, the BEI basic, you're allowed to now interpret in very limited
Same for
settings.
Michigan, same for a few other places. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
And then you go and you take the next BEI test, and now you can work in more places. And then you take the next BEI test, and now you can work in more places, right?
Yes.
So when Arizona adopted, like, started accepting the BEI, it was decided that that system was incongruent with
Ah.
Arizona. So interpreters who pass the BEI basic, which in Texas, if you have the BEI basic, you can only interpret in K-12 or post-secondary educational settings. But
Mhm.
if you get your BEI basic and then come here to Arizona, you get a general license,
Mhm.
which is the same as essentially having your NIC. Now,
True.
I was not part of the commission when this happened, and I don't totally understand the reasons for it. There probably are legitimate reasons. There probably are valid reasons for it. I just don't happen to understand. But lots of people have a problem with this, right?
Yes.
So
I can
this
see why.
is this is like the credentials themselves already had a system, and that system gets changed when it's applied in different ways,
All the
right?
states.
Right. So when we say that these credentials vary state to state, it's not just at the level of, oh, this state requires certification and this state requires nothing. There's like layers and layers of more nuance to
Yeah,
this.
that's
There's
true.
so much variability between states as far as credentialing goes.
And that's just states. Then we can even just look at agencies. How do
Hmm.
they treat these? You have any certification, a BEI basic to a master to a CL or whatever other, cool, pass. That's a certification and we count it. Um, regular
Or
old
we're
hiring
seeing
agencies who know nothing.
exactly. We're seeing
Well, take anything.
lots of spoken language agencies who
Yes.
have no idea that
No.
there are these kinds of credentials for ASL interpreters because spoken language interpreters don't
Right.
have, they're even lower on the
And the
professionalization spectrum.
I wondered
And
that. And I
mhm,
hope to talk to a spoken language person sometime, but thinking of um RID and the NIC test, CASLI, and the changes it's gone through in the short amount of time. So then, like it says, the instability and the lack of trust or lack of um validity or of the test itself,
mhm,
no one quite knows what letters behind your name mean anymore.
mhm.
I'm hoping we get some type of stability with that. Um,
It's tough.
yep,
I don't fault the people who are at the helm of these
right.
testing systems.
Same. I'm
It's an
not, it
impossible,
is
it's an impossible ask. And not
right.
to say that other professions who are well established and are considered like stably professionalized, they went through, these are growing pains.
Right.
These are expected and typical growing pains on the path
Well,
of
and we're
professionalization.
a skill-based trade. We're
Hmm.
not taking a bar exam where we check A, B, C, or D. Like that's the hardest part for us to
Hmm.
kind of gauge. Um,
Absolutely. And serving an oppressed and underserved
right.
population. Um,
There's a
there's
lot of layers.
there's a lot of
Someone take
layers.
that. That's another project. next because we can't. I want to solve them all.
Seriously,
Oh,
each one of these could be their own master's thesis, for sure,
legit. So
for
we are
sure.
laying these out and get a hold of Cameo if you want to do this because this is we
I mean,
need people to do this.
I would say get a hold of Anna Water Merrithew or
Yes,
Leilani Johnson. Like
we
they are the
need.
guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the next one is in
Hmm.
what Tseng called induction.
Okay.
And essentially this is more where um, the graduation to certification gap kind
Mm.
of lays. So yes, it's how to like grow new practitioners, but also
Hmm.
support their development for them to become practicing professionals, right? Um, so so we already had the systems. I always forget what the systemic theory, right? Systemic theory is like the vehicle of how information is passed to the next generation. But then induction is the actual like growing of the new um,
And as you said,
practitioner,
we don't have those residency programs. We don't
right?
have those paid mentorship for 2 years in all of the areas. And there's plenty, I've seen a few theses about horizontal violence, and I've seen a lot of talk of crab theory, of how the crab theory of we are pulling each other down and not boosting each other up.
Hmm.
I feel that the fact that that's discussed and acknowledged, I want to say it's getting better, but I really would legit have love to have the conversations with those students and recent graduates, and I hope to on this podcast. What is happening out there? How do you feel? Um, yeah, I'm very
Yeah,
curious.
I'd be curious too. So induction deals more of like with the system, right? So
Ah,
so exactly what you mentioned with um the residency, the
yes, we don't have
the
the things in
paid,
place.
right? We don't have the things in place. And we see issues with induction even like earlier in the process. So we've had a huge decline in interpreter education program
Yep.
enrollment since COVID. My understanding is it's making a little bit of a comeback, but that was nationwide. And we have this new interesting phenomenon of online ASL classes. I don't know what other people's experience has been. I know that there are several fully online virtual and like interpreting programs.
Hmm.
And I try to keep up with the anecdotal evidence of how people feel about those programs, and it seems
Love,
like
hate.
it is a mixed bag.
Yeah,
Um, it does not seem like it's the kind of thing where like everyone is like, this is a terrible idea. Don't like no one's
it's both. It's a love, hate for
there's
sure.
not a collective like distrust
Mm-mm.
of that. But that being said, what we did see in the surveys that we sent out was the interpreter education programs. They what they were seeing was a greater challenge in welcoming in students to the interpreter program who all of their ASL instruction was online.
Interesting.
That those students tended to have um, they were not at the linguistic level
I
that
mean,
the program directors would expect to see at the, admission
right.
phase.
It's a 3D
Um,
language. And
so
I,
right,
I don't know if a piece fits with this of ASL being a foreign language in high school and ASL being cool is like, I thought that was going to make the interpreting field boom. I thought that was going to make this explode. Is that helping or hurting?
great question. No one knows.
Okay.
So at least here in Arizona, one thing that is a concern is that, first of all, Arizona isn't really known for its K-12 education, right? We're pretty low on the list of
Hmm.
states
Yeah.
that fund and provide high quality education, unfortunately. But in addition to that, the way that teachers get certified to be able to teach in certain subjects, when you look at Arizona's requirements for an ASL teacher to teach in
Mm.
high school, it is troubling. It's
And
highly troubling. So
yeah. So
we
that's
that
who's teaching
means
that ASL.
who's teaching that ASL, right?
Right.
And so what some of the interpreter education programs that we talked to for this study, what they said was they were starting to see an increase of students who took ASL in high school from a teacher who is maybe underqualified, certainly a second language learner. Um, and then they come to college, maybe they want to be an interpreter, but when they take, if there's some kind of like language screening process in order to get into the interpreting program, they're oftentimes told that they have to like start from the beginning. Or maybe like you have enough skill to skip ASL 1, but we want you back in ASL 2. And that student fully expected to
Right.
not need any
Right.
more language credits or jump in at ASL 3 or 4, right?
Right.
And so some students can feel gut punched by
For sure.
something like that, and they walk away from the
Yes.
field. What's
That
even
makes
more
sense.
concerning is that there are some programs at our universities that allow students who have like dual enrollment, if they
Hmm.
get dual enrollment from an ASL class in high school, there's a certain way, I'm not going to like beleaguer the process, but there's a certain way that they can then go to college and not have to take any more language classes
Mm-hmm.
and skip that whole like screening vetting process that the interpreter preparation program would do and graduate from college with the necessary credentials to then go teach ASL.
Yee.
That's happening here. I would imagine that it's
Yeah.
probably happening in lots of places. So I think that ASL classes in high school are a great way to get students exposure to ASL. I think that if they have high quality teachers and a great foundation of ASL, that could absolutely impact their success not only in college at the interpreter education program, but also probably reduce that graduation to certification gap. But when
Yeah.
you don't have the system in place to ensure that the teacher is a quality teacher, then you're just opening yourself up to all kinds of unintended consequences down the road.
Well, and we see why each of these characteristics has five other things underneath it that are belonging somewhere else to some like
Hmm.
we got to start at zero and we want to be at 50, but I don't even, I understand why we're in this space we're in
That's
as a
actually
field. I get it.
that's really demonstrative of one of the largest market disorders for the interpreting field. So we've talked about how there's this certain like organic progression for a field to grow into a professionalized, stable field, right? So most of the time when a field is in its infancy, they experience all of these market disorders early. The market disorders come before credentialing, before standardized education, before like the market disorders happen early, and then all of these other things like compensation and education and all of these things are in response to those market disorders. Because of the federal laws that made the field be in so high demand before there was really a profession, we did that backwards.
We didn't have time. Yeah.
Right. So we came together to start professionalizing, jumped to credentialing, which is what RID
Mm,
did, and we're still having all of the messy market disorders from early in the process when all of these things, the educational system, the credentialing system, all of these things were supposed to have pre-addressed these market disorders and we did it backwards. So I think our field is a really great example of first how legislation can muck that up for
mhm.
for a profession. It's probably a cautionary tale in that regard. But then also what happens to a profession when it jumps the line, when it does things kind of out of order. Not to say I'm certainly oversimplifying the process by saying like first you do this and then you do that. It's
Right.
not like a clean thing, and there's lots of jumping around and going back and forth. But certainly by the time standardized credentialing happens, many of the market disorders that we are still dealing with, the credentialing is in response to, and the education is in response to. And the fact that we haven't figured out those systems to respond to those market disorders yet is legit part of the problem.
Yeah. We are at
Yeah.
an hour, so I'm going to pause us for a second. So this is going to turn into a part two. So stay tuned.